Hi, in this lecture, I'm going to present a further argument that the Buddha gives against the existence of the self. But before doing so, it'll be helpful to clarify the notion of self in contrast to the notion of person. Recall that in the previous lecture, I presented the self, the type of self that the Buddha denies, as having three different features. These are that the self is a substance or thing, that the self is something permanent, and finally that the self is something that determines itself, that is to say it's independent and in control of itself. Now, that's what the Buddha denies, that there is any such self with all three of those features. So it might seem that the Buddha, in denying the self, might go too far. But he's not, because he has this more moderate position that although there are no selves, there are persons, and that this is what we refer to when we use words like I or me. So what is a person? Well, a person isn't a thing so much as a process. So it's a process that is constituted by a bundle of psychological states. So I might have hunger at one moment, then pleasure at satisfying that hunger the next, and then maybe sleepiness at the next moment. Well, you just take all those different feelings together and wrap them together as a bundle. So the different feelings at one moment in time and across time, those are what we call a person. And so notice here that a person is in constant flux because it has one psychological state, then another. And this person is really just those differing qualities or states and not some underlying thing behind or supporting those psychological qualities or states. Now, nevertheless, the psychological states are linked together. They're not totally disparate and unconnected. Rather, they're connected causally, for example. So, for example, hunger might lead to anger, where you have the phenomenon of being hangry. So that's the Buddha's view. There are no selves, but there are persons. Now, sometimes he might even use the term self and kind of admit that there is a self, but it's important to note that that's a more minimal conception of a self, not the self with the three features that we've specified. There's a second distinction that will help us understand the Buddha's view about the self. This second distinction is between two different kinds of reality or existence. On the one hand, there's ultimate reality, what truly exists whether we know it or not, whether we have language to talk about it or not. And on the other hand, there's what's called conventional reality. So that term conventional indicates that it's a reality that has its existence in virtue of human conventions. And those are realities that are really bundles or collections of features, just like a person, as we just saw. So a person has conventional reality because it's made up of a bunch of stuff that have ultimate reality. And we'll talk about those things that make up a person's ultimate reality in the next slide. But what's important to note is that these conventional realities are bundles of features. They're complex rather than simple. And they're bundles of features that we identify through our linguistic practices as being important, as being worth picking out in the world. So with this distinction, we can understand the Buddha's view as follows. The self has no ultimate reality or conventional reality. The self as a permanent substance that is self-determining has neither type of reality. The person, on the other hand, although it doesn't have ultimate reality because it's not a simple thing, it has conventional reality. It's a complex made up of simple things that we pick out as being important through our linguistic practices. So that leads to the question, what are the ultimate realities that compose the person? These are the so-called 5 skandhas. Now, the term skandha is usually translated by the term in English, aggregate. An aggregate meaning something that's just bundled together and it's not really unified in terms of any sort of structure. It's just a bundle of things that are unstructured. Now, it could also be translated with the term heap. Heap captures the notion very well, and it also links to a lot of the Buddha's other language, his other metaphors. In particular, his metaphors concerning fire. Now, we have these 5 skandhas. They're the heap of wood that can be put on fire, and that will help the fire continue to exist. But the Buddhist point, but that fire is suffering, and so we need to extinguish the fire. We need to minimize the fuel for that fire, and that will take place through the 5 skandhas, through these heaps. So what are these 5 skandhas specifically? It's a bit tricky to translate the different terms, but we roughly have body, which just amounts to physical matter. So it's not just one's personal body, but anything that's made up of physical matter, that counts as a body. And then you have feeling, like pleasures and pains. You have perception, and that's sort of the awareness of what is true or false. Then you have dispositions to action. So these would include emotions and desires. And then finally, consciousness, just this kind of bare awareness of various objects without perceiving something as being true or false. So those are the 5 things that make up everything that exists. You pick out anything that exists in the world, it's going to be made up of one or more of these 5 things. So these 5 things have ultimate reality if we were to use that distinction on the previous slide. Now, persons are made up of all 5 as well. But this will also help clarify one of the Buddha's arguments against a self, against a permanent, self-determining thing. This argument is presented in the discourse on the parable of the water snake. What happens there is that the Buddha names all 5 of these skandhas and presents the same argument against each of the 5. It can be useful here to organize things in a manner familiar to Western philosophy in terms of body and mind. So we'll talk about human beings as having bodies and minds, and we can sort of divide up the 5 skandhas accordingly. So we might think that the self is to be identified with the body. So, with the physical organs and their relationships. And so if you think that, then the Buddha asks to his students, is the body permanent or impermanent? And then it's clear that the body is impermanent. It's in constant flux. It doesn't work so well after time. Or you might kind of train your muscles, make it healthier, and so on. But what's important there is that it's in constant flux. And then the Buddha continues, is such a thing painful or pleasant? Well, it's painful. It's suffering. It's suffering in that metaphysical conception because it's dependent on other things. Now, I think the key point here is the next one. The Buddha says, and in regard to that which is impermanent, painful, and subject to change, is it proper that it be viewed as, this is mine, I am this is my permanent self? His students answer, no. So notice a couple of different things there. He identifies 3 different features, impermanence, painfulness, and being subject to change. And he says, if something has those 3 things, can we call it a self? And is it proper to call it a self and identify with that self? The little phrase there, this is mine, I am this is my permanent self, that's sort of a paraphrase of something in one of the Vedic texts. And so he's clearly responding to the Vedic tradition there and using that phrase. And he's asking, wait, is the Veda's use of this phrase really a proper one to use with respect to body? And the answer is no. And the reason is that body doesn't live up to the standards that are required for something to be a permanent self, for something to be a true self, as the Vedic tradition had wanted. And that's because, I think we can emphasize, it's because body is impermanent and subject to change especially. It's not going to be something that exists eternally and undergoes changes, but has some stability and can be in control of itself. Now that takes care of body, but there's also mind, the various mental aspects of reality. And recall, those include feeling, perception, dispositions to action, and consciousness. And so the Buddha runs through each of those four things with the exact same argument. Is each one of those things something permanent or impermanent? Each one is in constant flux, so it's impermanent. Is each one of those painful or pleasant? Well, each one's painful. Then finally, each one is subject to change. That means it's not proper to identify it as being a permanent self. It doesn't live up to that standard. Now that I've talked through those passages, let us formulate his argument a bit more schematically. So the first premise of this reformulated argument can be put as follows. There's no more to a person than the five skandhas. So if we're thinking in terms of persons, which the Buddha says have conventional reality, they do exist conventionally, and they're composed of these five different things. But is there more to existence than just persons? Is there something over and above persons, namely the self? Well, that's what the rest of the argument will show that there isn't. So the second premise of this argument says that each of the five skandhas are impermanent, as we just saw previously. But if there were a self, if there were something that could live up to the name of a self, it would have to be something permanent and not impermanent. Therefore, there is no permanent self. None of the ultimate things that exist could live up to the name, but it's likewise the case that even if you were to take more than one of those at a time, and you say, well, maybe body and feeling together, well, those could count as a self. Well, no, because body and feeling together both are impermanent, and adding two impermanent things doesn't really get you something permanent. So if the Buddha is right that these are the ultimate realities that make up a person, and each one of those is impermanent, and also that you don't get something permanent by adding them together, it follows that there is no self, no permanent self. We can also rephrase this argument in terms of one of the other characteristics of what a self would have to be. The self would have to be self-determining or in control of itself. But the Buddhist point still stands. For example, it experiences pain because other things might hit it or cut it. Likewise, perception is not self-determining because it relies on perceiving things out there in the external world that will have an effect upon it. You can't just choose to perceive things however you want. Rather, you're given this input that causes you to have perceptions of a particular sort. And then the same thing will apply for each of the other skandhas. And so the whole argument runs the same way. Each one of those five things is not self-determining, but rather determined or dependent on other things. But a self would have to be something self-determining, and so we cannot find anything that is self-determining, so there is no such self, there is no self worthy of the name, something that would be self-determining, something that would be in control of itself. So it's important to emphasize here that this is not an argument against persons. Persons do exist, but they have merely conventional reality. But we might wonder here, if we're not supposed to believe in a self and only believe in a person, what does that amount to in practice? That's a tricky question, but I think we can look at one passage to get a sense of it. What the Buddha suggests is that we should abandon what is not ours. He says, abandoning that will be for your welfare and happiness for a long time. And what is not yours? That is to say, what is it that you're not in control of? each of the 5 skandhas: body, feeling, perception, dispositions to action, and consciousness. And so what does it mean to give up those things? It means that you should say, quote, "This is not mine. I am not this. This is not my permanent self." What this means is that you shouldn't be attached to each one of those things. You shouldn't think that you can have control over all of your feelings, that you can have control over how well things will go for your body. So ultimately, this amounts to a radical shift in perspective. And this shift in perspective will have ethical consequences, which we'll turn to in the next lecture.